It doesn't matter where, what city, state, or country. Late at night, in a quiet alley, or a dark street corner, you can find my antique store. It isn't grandiose or puffed up, rather, it's a quaint, cozy little store nestled comfortably in between whatever buildings surrounded at the time. There, swaying in the midnight breeze above our door, you'll find a sign that reads, Fortune's Toll Antique Shop. It's open to all, young and old, needy and wealthy. However, we are tailored to one specific sort of people, the desperate ones. We're here to help, and we do the best we can. We've heard it all. I can't afford rent this month. My loved one's health took a turn for the worse. I got fired from my job. Any and every problem has been, or will, eventually be brought to us. Now, we've been around for longer than anyone can remember, and will continue to exist for as long as there are needy people. The merchandise lining our shelves is as diverse as it gets. High quality art supplies, typewriters, bicycles, furniture. We have anything and everything you could ever need. However, the physical merchandise is not what brings customers in through that old oaken door. No. What keeps us in business is our primary line of trade. Whilst we do sell antiques, we also deal in the trade of miracles. Of course, as with every business, our product isn't free. If it were, we would be quite the charitable organisation. But alas, that is not how this works. Still, prices are agreed upon before purchase. We don't deal in stereotypical horror movie tropes wherein one unknowingly pays for something with their own soul or some other nonsense along those lines. There are full contracts written and signed with every purchase. The greater the feat being bargained for, the higher the price of the antique. To give an easy example, say someone wanted to win the lottery. We would sell them one of our antique coins we keep behind the counter. All they would then need to do is buy a lottery ticket with these old coins, and they would win without fail. A smaller lottery may cost them less, perhaps knocking a few days off of their lifespan or taking some belonging away from them that they value. However, if you wanted to win a real prize, the kind that would ensure that neither you or your children would ever need to work again, the price would be far steeper. I can provide some examples of a few of the contracts I've seen that have stuck out to me over my time working here. 2 years ago, an elderly man strolled in through our door early in the morning. He had lost his hearing in his old age, and we offered him a contract. We sold him a pair of hearing aids that would restore hearing to a state even better than before. However, he would lose his left eye. He took our deal after a good bit of explanation. After all, having 1.5 senses trumps 1 sense, I suppose. Next, last year, a young lady came moping into our store. She hadn't been able to sleep and a midnight walk had led her here. I discovered that she had her heart broken by her unfaithful lover. And to numb her pain, we provided her with a leather journal to pour her negative emotions into. For instance, she could write the word sad and immediately be incapable of sadness for the next year. As the contract we gave her explained, with every negative emotion, a positive one had to be given up too. The most extreme example I've ever seen was 3 months ago. A newlywed couple burst into our door, arguing with harsh whispers. And after I introduced myself, and after some prodding, I discovered they had been trying for a baby. They had visited a doctor a week before, and had received some rather upsetting news. The husband was incapable of having children, so, happy to offer them a solution, a contract was drafted to sell them an old crib. And they were to keep it in their bedroom when they slept. A month later, they were pregnant. I told you the cost could be steep. In this case, the price was the lives of their parents. 4 lives for one seemed harsh to me, but then again, considering the parents were well aged, perhaps the sum of remaining years in each person's lifespan was the key factor. And to be clear, I don't make the contracts, I'm just the clerk. I've never actually met my boss. I was once just like any other customer, a desperate man at the end of my rope, but for some reason, I was offered a different kind of deal. I guess the store needed a clerk. I'm not sure what happened to the last one, but I was offered a job. I had been scouring the store for a solution to my problem. I was freshly fired and at risk of being evicted, when I found a note neatly placed on the counter with my name written in cursive letters on the front. I opened it and found my contract. I'm sure I don't need to explain what choice I made. The pay's good, I'm not wealthy, but I make enough to be comfortable. I would never have stolen from here. My employer has to know that. It wouldn't make sense for me to. I've been a perfect employee. It began a week ago, with small, relatively unexplainable coincidences. On my way to work, I stepped on a $20 bill. My favourite restaurant had overbooked, and to make up for it, I got a free meal. My paycheck last week had a small bonus that came with it. Then it started to snowball. My broken dishwasher seemingly fixed itself, working perfectly once again. On slow days, I sometimes switch on the radio to pass the time. That same afternoon, I won a competition on the channel I usually listen to for vacation to Panama, one I hadn't entered. I also got an email a few days ago informing me that I had inherited $50,000 from a relative I had never known. At this point, I had become suspicious. I searched through my house for anything I could recognize from the antique store, and after an hour of searching, I found it. Sitting in my coat pocket was a silver, embroidered pocket watch. My heart sank. I hadn't meant to take it home. I'd been polishing it to return it to the shelves when a customer came up to me to ask about an item. I must have slipped it into my coat pocket and forgotten about it. I'm not a thief. My boss must know that. I tried to return it. I went straight back and returned the item to its home on the shelves, but it was too late. Once an item leaves the store, it belongs to whoever took it. I knocked on the door to my boss's office, but it was empty. I honestly don't know if there's ever been anyone in that room. On top of all that, I can't call anyone. There isn't exactly a helpline for this. Fortune's Toll Antique Shop has no policy against theft. If someone does steal, we simply let them go with a smile and a wave. Because when you steal from here, you're only robbing yourself. And without drafting a contract for an item, you deprive yourself of the safety those long clauses and limitations provide. The item and the price that accompanies it are no longer limited by the degree of miracle that's intended. In cases like these, you could be trading your life for something as small as a free sandwich. That isn't to say the price becomes random. The correlation between degree and price still exists. It's only far more risky. For example, finding some change in your pocket could cost you your hands. A scratch-off ticket for $50 could cost you a loved one. A new car could cost you most of your years. My luck hasn't stopped yet, but I know that when it does, I'll have hell to pay. So far, I've found $20, a free meal, a trip to Panama, and inherited another $50,000. I don't know what it will cost me, but I've drafted up my will already. I have no immediate family, which is a relief. At least this impending doom will be confined to just me. All that is left for me to do is enjoy my luck until the moment that it runs out. Because when it does, it's very likely that I will expire with it. My time is almost here. When I arrived at work today, I found a man reading something by my desk. And after I inquired, he told me that he had found a note on the counter. one with his name written on it in neat cursive letters. I'd like to start off with an apology. If I am correct, I may just have killed you and everyone you know. Hopefully that isn't the case, but if it is, I'm sorry. I've been working as an immunologist for the past 17 years, and I'm quite well known for my work. Throughout my life, I've lost people I cared about to disease. My mother died from tuberculosis when I was 5. My best friend died of leukemia when I was 16. And my father has recently been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. I've always viewed it as a malicious and evil thing that robs us of our family and friends. So it's for this reason that I chose to study the immune system. It's truly a fascinating thing. Our bodies are somehow incredibly resilient and terribly delicate at the same time. My goal was to contribute to the eradication of disease. Well, I suppose the same can be said for all immunologists, but I worked with a fiery hatred for pestilence and sickness. I wanted, in a sense, to get revenge on the being that I had made up in my head, this evil figure I had conjured up to personify disease. I was after more than just one. I didn't want to be the man who ended cancer or AIDS. I wanted to rid humanity of the greatest threat it ever had. My goal was to end as many diseases as I possibly could with one strike. I'll keep my explanation as brief as I can. I know you didn't come here for a science lesson. The human immune system is incredibly complex and has a vast array of countermeasures it uses to kill off pathogens. However, this all relies on the first step of the process, recognition. In order for anything to happen, some immune cells need to come into contact with the foreign body afflicting the host. This can be any number of cells, T cells, B cells, macrophages, dendritic cells, NK cells, the list goes on. Once this happens, receptors on these cells bind to specific surface proteins on the pathogen, which starts the next step of the process. The pathogen is engulfed and digested, and afterwards, the cell takes pieces of this now dead pathogen and brings it to other immune cells to activate more immune responses. After a long list of signaling pathways, the host produces antibodies which bind to the pathogens and flag them for destruction. Later, when one of the many killer cells encounters a pathogen marked by antibodies, it will be swiftly eliminated. Now, this process can apply to all types of diseases, bacterial, viral, even cancers. So why can't we just synthetically make a bunch of antibodies and shoot them into sick people? Well, there are many reasons actually, but one of them is the issue of immune response recognition. When your immune system goes out to kill targeted cells, how does it know which cells are good and which are bad? The answer is a molecule called sialic acid. Your cells produce this on their surfaces so that even if an immune cell binds to them, it can recognize the sialic acid structures on the surface and move on from it. But some diseases, disgusting and vile as they are, have evolved to use this to their advantage. Some of the most dangerous diseases are able to coat themselves in sialic acid in order to evade immune detection. For example, influenza binds to sialic acid on respiratory cells to gain entry into your lungs. Some bacteria, like Neisseria meningitidis, actually steal sialic acid from their host to create a disguise. And one of the reasons cancer is so difficult to treat is that cancer cells overproduce sialic acid, effectively wearing a "do not kill" sign that prevents immune cells from recognizing them as threats. This allows all of them to go about their business killing innocent people and spreading to others. To combat this, humans have developed a treatment, one mainly for cancer, using sialidase, an enzyme that breaks down sialic acid from molecules. Think of it as a chainsaw that cuts off sialic acid and allows the bad cells to be recognized by your immune system. there is only one problem with this. Sialidase is not specific. It will rip off sialic acid from your own cells if it comes into contact with them. But in this enzyme, I saw the key to free us all from the burden of sickness. If I could use a vehicle to ensure that sialidase only comes into contact with non-self cells, I would be able to strip away their advantage and expose them to the immune system. And I had the perfect one. It feels strange to condense years of my life and hard work to just a few sentences. In my studies, I became deeply familiar with the measles virus, an endlessly fascinating entity. You see, measles causes infected cells to fuse together, forming massive clumps called syncytia. If I could modify the virus to carry the sialidase enzyme, these clusters would become their own undoing. As the cells fused, sialidase would strip away the sialic acid from all of them at once, leaving them completely exposed to the immune system's wrath. And that's exactly what I did. It was tested on rodents a week ago and it worked perfectly. But when I tried to get this new treatment approved, I was shut down almost immediately. I was outraged. I had invented a way to eradicate a plethora of life-threatening diseases, and this miracle cure wasn't even going to be considered? Unfortunately, I took matters into my own hands. This drug was going to save my father. I knew it. So, I went to the hospital he is being treated at. He's been spending most of his time sleeping. Cancer has a way of draining energy from its victims. I injected him with my treatment quickly. He didn't even wake up. Satisfied, I left the hospital and headed to the lab. The rats needed feeding, and then I could finally relax at home. Only when I saw the rats did I realize my error. In my fervor to create this miracle cure, I had made the same mistake that the human immune system does. I hadn't been specific enough. My goal was to make the measles virus, with sialidase attached to it, bind to any foreign bodies and force them to clump together. This would then allow the enzyme to remove this sialic acid from all the pathogens and allow them to all be recognized by the immune system. But sialidase isn't specific. It had shorn off the protein that causes the measles virus to bind. The result of this was a free-floating virus that could bind to any cell and shear off its sialic acid, making it a target for its host's immune system. The rats in their cages had partially liquefied, their bodies reduced to a putrid, gelatinous slurry. Only a few fragments of bone and shredded tissue remained, barely recognizable as what had once been a living creature. A rancid mix of blood and dissolved flesh pooled at the bottom of their cages, the stench thick and suffocating. Without another thought, I rushed back to the hospital and back to my father's room. But it was too late. I'm not sure why, but it acted quickly, far more so than it had with the rats. My dad had woken from his sleep with agonizing screams. Blood ran from every orifice, his eyes, nose, ears and mouth. He reached out a semi-solid hand towards me. I could see the veins and muscles through his skin. And as he reached out, his hand fell from his arm and splattered onto the floor by my feet. His now milky white eyes rolled into his skull as he fell back into bed, motionless. His torso caved in on itself, exposing his liquefied organs to the open air. His body was eating itself because of what I had done. Nurses and doctors rushed in and out of the room, but I know they wouldn't be able to help. An older nurse grabbed my arm and led me outside, but I couldn't hear his words. My ears rung from what I had seen, what I had caused. I vomited in the flower bed. I didn't know what else to do, so I went home, where I'm now drafting this up. There's one more detail about the measles virus that I didn't mention. It's highly contagious. In fact, in unvaccinated populations, it has a 100% infection rate. Not that a vaccine would help anymore. I've modified the virus to the point where a new vaccine would need to be developed. But judging by how fast it worked on my father, I don't think we have that kind of time. Every single one of the people who were in that hospital likely have it, me included. By tomorrow, hundreds of people will be infected. A week from now, thousands or more. But chances are I'll be dead by then. I truly hope I'm wrong. But if I'm not, I really am sorry. He's dead, I thought, finally realizing stood over his body. What am I going to do? And truth was, I had no idea. Murder was a serious charge. I'd watched those true crime documentaries. I knew how this worked. The killer always gets caught, no matter what. God, I'm a killer. I looked around. We were in a small clearing in the woods east from my house. Woods that nobody ever went into, which was partly why we did. It was so that we could do whatever we wanted. You know, stupid challenges, games, that sort of stuff. Stuff for laughs. But I wasn't laughing, and Josh certainly wasn't either. I looked back down at his body. It was awful. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his face was split open in an awful way, down the left side of his head. You'd have to squint really hard if you even wanted to lie to yourself that it looked anything remotely human. I felt another pang of adrenaline. I need to be smart. I need to make this go away. I have to. I moved over to my left. There was a ditch here, about 2 meters deep, shallow on one side but rocky on the other. I looked back behind me towards Josh's bike and started to piece a story together. Maybe, I thought, maybe he was riding his bike down here. He got distracted by something. Maybe he went into those sharp rocks. Along the shallow side of the ditch, there was a bit where the rim turned upwards, like a ramp. Okay, he went along here, this ramp, got distracted, hit the rocks. It was the only thing I could think of. Maybe the sharp rocks slit his face like that. It might be a little far-fetched, but it was the best that I could think of. I took a deep breath and lifted Josh. He was heavier than I thought, and I almost slipped in the wet dirt as I hoisted him over my shoulder and carefully placed him in the ditch. I tried to make it look like he was crawling away. He probably wouldn't have died straight away. Satisfied with the placement of him, I turned my attention to the bike. It was still pristine, as me and him had just stopped and leant them against a tree earlier on. No, that's not going to work, I thought. It needs to be bashed up more. I grabbed his bike and slowly rolled it down the mud in the path it would have gone, and then lifted it up and threw it across the ditch into the rocks. I picked it back up and did it again. Yeah, that looks alright. I didn't pick it back up afterwards. It was already in a good spot, and probably would be more authentic if I didn't pose it. The last thing I did was take my jacket off. With all the blood on it, I hoisted it under my arm and put it on the seat of my bike, and after taking one last look back, rode back home. I left Josh there, and with him, a little bit of myself. I unlocked the front door of my house and hurried inside. I ran up to my room immediately and hid the coat under my bed. I'll figure out what to do with it later. I dulled my brain with a shooter game, barely paying attention. The rain outside was a small mercy. Maybe it would wash some evidence away. My mum was coming back from work by now, and so I was now trying to act in higher spirits so nothing seemed too off. I guessed I probably had up until this evening, before the police would be called. Josh usually lingered in town for a few hours after we hung out, and so it wasn't unusual for him to be home late. But he wouldn't come home today. I heard the key turn in the door. It made me jump. I got up and plastered a smile across my face and went to meet her at the front door. "Hello, Dan," she screamed from the hallway. "Hey, Mum," I said, lingering in the doorway, arms crossed. "Did you have fun with Josh today?" she said, back turned to me, hanging her coat up. Yeah, I did. I had to come home a bit early though. He said he needed to do something." "Ah, well, I'm sure it was important. Anyway, it's the holidays now. You could always hang out with him tomorrow." "Yeah," I said, my smile slowly fading. When I went to bed that night, every time I closed my eyes, I could see that ditch etched into my mind. The mangled roots, the mangled bike, the mangled body. I got maybe half an hour of sleep before my alarm jolted me awake at 5 a.m. I immediately remembered Josh's face. Twisted, warped, impossible. I felt like a stranger in my skin. The air was suffocating. The rooms in my house felt far larger than I'd ever noticed, and that they had any right to be. Large and empty. Nothing felt right. I don't know how to describe it to you because I can't even really understand it myself, but the thought of Josh's parents sat there, worry building, waiting anxiously for a boy who would never come back, their only son, made me feel... I felt sick. I'm not sure if my mum had noticed something was up. I mean, she must have, but I noticed her giving me weird looks for that entire morning. Occasional glances. All of this pressure kept building and building and building to an almost unbearable level until, at about 1 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. My mum answered it, and as I sat there in the living room, head in my hands, I could hear what the man at the door was saying. It was muffled, but clear enough for me to hear parts of it. "Yes." "No, he didn't. His parents haven't seen him. If we could just..." "Dan," my mum said, opening the door and letting the man into the room. "This man here just needs to ask you some questions. It's about Josh." I bottled everything down, swallowed, and then spoke as clearly as I could. Maybe a little bit too quickly, but it was the best I could do. "Josh?" I looked away from my mum and now at the officer. He had a warm, kind facial expression, but with a tinge of unease and awkwardness. He was about to break the news. "I'm not supposed to know yet." "What's happened to him?" I chuckled slightly. "Has he gotten himself into some more..." I trailed off. "Listen, Dan. Josh hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Now, we've spoken to his mother, and she says that she last saw him when he went out with you. Now, if that's true, this means that you might have been the last person to have seen him." I was staring at the name tag on his uniform. I didn't interpret it as letters, just shapes. I wasn't really focusing on it anyway. He shuffled in his seat slightly. "Look, I know it's a lot to handle right now, and I understand that you two are close. But do you think that we could just ask you some questions?" I told him that we went up to the woods, although I lied about where exactly. And then I said that after a little while of just chilling out, he had gone further in, and I'd just turned around and gone home. All the while, the officer was nodding comfortingly and never once changed facial expression from that slight smile. The smile that didn't reach the eyes. I suppose I was relieved, I guess, that I wasn't being taken in or arrested. In fact, I didn't get any sort of feeling that he even considered me a suspect. And I don't blame him. I don't have a history of anything. I never get into fights at school. I keep my head down. There's not a lot to go on there. And one kid in the woods on his own? Anything could have happened. A murder, especially by the kid's best friend, probably wouldn't be high on the list of possibilities. After about half an hour, the officer left, saying he would keep us posted on the search effort, and that was that. Apart from the odd missing poster I put around town, there wasn't really much reminding me of Josh. I'd stopped riding my bike though. That at least was something that reminded me of that scene. But it was getting easier. I got rid of the jacket with all the blood on it, and although the officers came back to the house a few times, I stuck to the same story, and after a few days they stopped. I felt like I could finally start moving on at least. Occasionally, I'd pass by the window of Josh's house on the way into town and see his mother sat, head in hands. She'd give me that comforting smile, the same one that didn't quite reach the eyes, and I'd return it. And deep down, I didn't know what was worse. That I had actually done the crime in the first place, or the fact that I was brushing it off so easily. However, this brief comfort ended about a week after the day I'd killed him, because after I'd hidden his mangled body in a ditch and lied to everyone I knew, I got a knock on the door, and as I peered through the window to check who it was, my blood ran cold. Josh was stood outside my front door, grinning. I just sort of stood there like an idiot. It was him, of course it was. It was Josh, and somehow his face looked fine. It looked normal. His face was all back in place and his clothes looked fine. He had noticed me by this point. He waved to grab my attention, and with that grin still on his face, eagerly pointed towards the door, mouthing, "Let me in." I didn't know exactly what to think, but I found myself unlocking the front door. And there he was. The person I'd left muddied and bloodied in the woods stood about a meter away from me, clean and healthy. He pushed past me without a word and walked in. "Hey, I thought we were going back out to the woods today." It took me a second to turn around and face him, to process what he had just said. "Josh, you... Well, are we going to go then?" he interrupted, still grinning but with slight impatience. He pushed back past me into the garden before I even had a chance to say anything. He went and got on his bike that he had left leant against the front of my house. That clean, very much not battered bike. I rode next to him. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. I could still see his mangled face in my mind. It still haunted me. And now, it was all too much. It was supposed to be final. I'd convinced him to avoid the woods. He had protested, but I was adamant. I didn't want to go back there anytime soon. And I wasn't sure what I'd find there anyway. But he was still smiling. It hadn't fallen once since he'd arrived at my house, and it wasn't getting any less unsettling. We were riding now into town. He said we'd go and pick up some food, then sit down somewhere and just hang. I looked back at him again. He slowed to a stop. Heh, look at that. I turned and faced the other way. He was pointing at one of those missing posters that his mother, only a few days ago, had plastered up on every pole or wall around town. What about it? My voice, hollowed, managed at least to blurt that out coherently enough. Well, I don't know. It's weird how everyone thought I was missing for a week, right? Even my mum. It's not like her to forget. I furrowed my brow. Seeing that missing poster at least meant I wasn't going crazy, but still, I had to be cuckoo somehow. I mean, she even called the police, if you can believe that. I grunted. But it's okay, he continued. I told her about what happened and she phoned him saying it was all alright. I noticed I was slowing down, so I caught back up to him, and as we rode further up our road past his house, we both slowed as we approached a window. My eyes involuntarily drifted toward it. I looked, and after Josh waving, we both saw his mother grinning and waving back, her head moving between two people. 2 people. I stopped suddenly. He stopped too and looked at me in confusion. I tried to think about how to ask this. I didn't want to be too direct, but I still needed to know the truth. "Listen, Josh." I looked at him, and he nodded. "What did you mean when you said your mum forgot?" He started chuckling and seemed to relax a bit. "Well, it's the funniest thing." He leaned in closer towards me. She, somehow, doesn't remember driving me up to the camping spot last Tuesday. Isn't that mad? I blurted an affirmation. Tuesday? That was the day after I killed him. I pressed further. Do you remember what happened last Monday? His grin stopped for a moment and then returned. Well, come on. Of course I remember. You do too, right? In the woods? He chuckled and started riding again. I joined him, dumbfounded. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, as difficult as that was, and pretended that everything was fine. We stopped off at the chip shop, picked some food up and rode up to the park just as we would do often. It was really odd. It wasn't the fact that he was back from the dead that freaked me out. It was the way he was acting. He was like this normally, stupidly positive. And before, that was something that was always good. Things were always fun with Josh, but now it was creeping me out. And the fact that he seemed to know what I did to him as well. Does he know I killed him? We sat and ate in silence. I couldn't think of anything to say, and he seemed to be perfectly content eating his chips, so I didn't feel a need to say anything. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. What have you been up to in the last week then, while I was gone? He paused, smiling. Camping? Camping? I found myself mutter. Yeah, of course. I messaged you last week about it. Don't tell me you're forgetting too. His teeth chomped down on another chip. I felt for my phone. I hadn't got a text from him, I knew that. I'd spent the first few days after I'd killed him constantly rereading our last conversation. I unlocked my phone, Josh still happily eating, and navigated to our messages. I read our last conversation. It was on Sunday. I breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't happen. Josh stopped eating and looked at my phone. He grabbed it out of my hands. What are you up here? He chortled. Look, you have to scroll down, you knob. He scrolled the chat down and then thrust the phone into my face. I read what it said. Monday, 12:10 p.m. Oi Dan, listen, I'm going camping tomorrow. Can't remember if I told you or not. I swallowed. I'd never seen that text before. He frowned suddenly and looked back at my phone. Oh look, he said. I didn't scroll far enough. He fumbled with it for a second and then placed it into my hands. He turned away and continued eating. I looked and focused down at the phone. It was the most recent message on Monday last week at 12:12 p.m. It said, Mate, why do you never invite me to these things? Anyway, hope you have fun, bro. I chuckled nervously for a split second and then stopped myself. The text is from me. I looked at Josh, keeping eye contact with him while slowly turning my phone off and placing it into my pocket. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and smiled. You gonna eat any of yours? I hadn't even touched my portion. I looked around the park for a second. The only exit was in front of us, in front of the bench. I looked back at Josh. Yeah, listen. I sprang to my feet and got onto my bike, and as I started pedaling, I shouted to him, You can finish them! I turned my attention back to what was in front of me. I knew where I needed to go. I could hear him calling my name, no doubt getting on his bike and chasing after me, but I knew where I needed to go and what I needed to do. But first of all, I had to lose him. As I left the park gates, I immediately turned left into an alley and then turned right. I continued straight ahead for a while before turning out back onto the main road. I was heading towards the woods. I slowed slightly and turned around. I couldn't see him. I didn't know how close he was, but he didn't have line of sight to me, which was something. I gritted my teeth and entered the woods. I still remembered the route that we went that day. I mean, it wasn't a particularly difficult one. It was mainly a straight line with a hard left, and the landmarks along the route were distinct enough for me to remember easily. And when I got there, my suspicions were confirmed. The body in the bike was still there, exactly as I left it It was rotting now. I gagged and looked away. So what the fuck is the Josh I was just eating chips with? I didn't know what to do. I could point the body out to the police, that would work. An autopsy would say that the body was rotting for a week. That would prove that the Josh that was still alive was some kind of fake, but would they then realise that it was me? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn in... Don't do that. I turned around. Josh was stood next to his bike about maybe 10 metres away from me. He wasn't smiling anymore. How did you... What the fuck are you? I said, but he didn't answer. You're not going to tell the police anything, he said. I'll be back up here in a bit to sort all of this out. What are you? I repeated. Listen, you let me live my life and I'll let you live yours. We won't talk about this again. His voice was sounding oddly deep and raspy. Remember, it's what you did. I'll see you soon. But before I could respond, he was already far away.